Hello and welcome to the Hoopheads podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here without my co-host Jason Sonkel tonight. Jason is feeling a little bit under the weather, so I decided to go Han Solo on our NBA pod tonight. We're going to hit on 5 different topics that are current in the NBA, and we're going to start with our hometown Cleveland Cavaliers, who beat the Milwaukee Bucks tonight 123-116 without Giannis Antetokounmpo, who was injured in the Bucks game against the Pacers on Sunday night. Reports say that Giannis is going to be out for a week, although at this point, it certainly seems like what the Bucks should do and what Giannis should do is just shut him down for the remainder of the season. At this point, they're 6.5 games behind Charlotte for the number 10 seed in the play-in. So it seems highly, highly unlikely that barring a season-ending multiple game winning streak for the Bucks or a similar losing streak for the Hornets, that there is any chance that the Bucks would catch the Charlotte Hornets. So the Bucks, therefore, probably should just have Giannis shut it down for this year, try to lose as many games as possible. As we know, the Bucks and the Hawks and the Pelicans have sort of a back and forth swap with their picks. Right now, the worst of those 2 picks would go to Atlanta. And although New Orleans keeps winning, they are currently 23-46, and their pick's going to fall somewhere in the 6, 7, 8 range. And if the Bucks can somehow keep losing, maybe their pick is not that far behind the Pelicans pick that's going to go to Atlanta, and maybe Milwaukee could secure themselves either a top 10 pick if the picks fall the way that the odds say, or who knows, maybe one of those picks or both of them could jump up and potentially give the Bucks an even better situation in the draft. So Milwaukee's in kind of an interesting position, and Giannis obviously wants to play, which is why he came back in the first place. But now this knee injury continues to complicate the Bucks' ability to be able to eventually trade Giannis. Like Jason and I have talked about numerous times, when you're trading for Giannis, you're not exactly getting a guy who has been a paragon of health over the last couple of years. And can he stay healthy for the entirety of a regular season and then for a 2-month playoff run for potential contenders that might want to trade for Giannis? I'm not sure that's going to happen. But anyway, the Cavs beat the Bucks tonight after splitting over the weekend a baseball series with the Dallas Mavericks, where they won the first game and then inexplicably lost to the tanking Mavericks in the second game. And that gets me to what I wanted to talk about in terms of the Cleveland Cavaliers and how they fit into the Eastern Conference playoff picture. Right now, the Cavs are pretty solidly entrenched in the 4 seed. They're 2.5 games behind the New York Knicks, and they are 2.5 games ahead of the Toronto Raptors. And when you look at how the Eastern Conference breaks out, clearly I think most people believe that there is a divide between the top 4 teams, Detroit, Boston, the Knicks, and the Cavs, and then everybody else, starting with the Raptors, who are currently in the 5th spot, Orlando, who had briefly taken over that 5th spot, and then in the play-in, you have Miami, Atlanta, who's won 10 in a row, the Sixers, and the Hornets. I think in the Eastern Conference, and I don't know what the Cavs are doing, and I don't know how you lose to the tanking Dallas Mavericks, but what I do know is that all things being equal, I think the Cleveland Cavaliers would probably prefer to fall into that number 4 seed, which would allow them to play most likely at this point, probably Toronto, Orlando, or Miami in that 4-5 matchup and have home court. And then that would allow them in the second round, were they to be able to get past those teams. And again, I've said this numerous times, I would be nervous if I was the Cavs facing any of those teams. I just feel like the Cavs' mental and physical toughness and what they've tried to do over the course of the last 3 playoff runs have proven that there's something that this team has lacked when it comes to playoff basketball. I think it's mental and physical toughness. And adding James Harden, as we've said many times, I don't know if that changes the equation in terms of certainly mental toughness or physical toughness. I've liked what I've seen from Harden in the regular season, but as we all well know, regular season James Harden is far different from playoff James Harden. So all that being said, I think the Cavs want to finish 4th because that gives them a first round series against what should be a beatable opponent. I don't know that there's much difference in terms of how easy that first round series is going to be, whether you get Toronto, Orlando, Miami, Atlanta, the Hornets. I think the only team that you could probably say would be an easy mark at this point would be the Sixers if Joel Embiid continues to struggle with injury, and obviously Tyrese Maxey's out right now. But a healthy Philadelphia team would be a little scary with Paul George coming back off the suspension at some point and getting back for the playoffs, getting in shape. And if you have Embiid, like I said, I don't think Embiid can play for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I don't see that, but could he be healthy for 2 weeks for a first round playoff series and make the Sixers a scary opponent? I think he could. So no matter what you do, I think you're probably going to have a relatively difficult first round series, certainly more difficult than the one the Cavs faced last year when they steamrolled Miami 4-0 in the first round. I think honestly, as I look at these teams, I'd probably most want to play Toronto, although Toronto beat the Cavs early in the season a couple times and pretty handily. I'd still be scared of Toronto, but I think all these teams could give the Cavs a pretty good matchup. And I think that they'll give the Knicks, the Celtics, the Pistons all a pretty good matchup as well. But if we do make it to the second round with chalk, then I think that's where it starts to get interesting in terms of staying in the 4 seed as opposed to moving up into the 2 or 3. So if, let's just say the Cavs stay at 4 and they win their first round series and so does Detroit, now you're looking at playing the Pistons in the second round, who despite their outstanding regular season, we've talked a lot about their inefficiencies from an offensive standpoint, with Cade being their only real high level playmaker and their lack of shooting around Cade. They just don't have some of the offensive firepower, certainly that the Celtics and the Knicks have. Now defensively and from a toughness standpoint, that worries me a little bit about against the Cavs, but I do think that Boston and New York also have maybe a toughness advantage on the Cavs, and those teams also have the type of offensive firepower that the Pistons lack. So if you're giving me a second round matchup, I think I'd much rather play the Pistons than play Boston or New York. And that also means that Boston and New York are going to be playing each other, which has been a rivalry. Obviously last year, the Knicks beat the Celtics in a series where Jason Tatum goes down with that Achilles injury. And it looked like New York was already on their way to a 3-1 advantage in that series after the 2 20-point comebacks in games 1 and 2 in Boston. And they ended up closing out the Celtics in 6. And so you know that the Celtics are going to want some revenge for that series. And Tatum's continuing to work his way back from the Achilles injury. Boston's regular season has been nothing short of miraculous compared to what everybody thought. And I just think if you're the Cavs and you can avoid having to play both the Celtics and the Knicks and instead get a series against Detroit, I think that's probably where you want to be. It looked like a week ago maybe that Boston might have a chance to pass the Pistons, as the Pistons had kind of been scuffling and Boston was on a little bit of a hot streak. But since then, the Celtics have dropped off a little bit. Detroit has continued to stack up victories. They won tonight, I believe, against the Wizards. Not a very tough game, but they won 130-117. So I think it looks like at this point that Detroit, I would say, is probably going to hold on to that number 1 seed. So if you're the Cavs, I think you want the 4 seed. That gives you Toronto, Orlando, Miami, maybe Atlanta if they keep winning, although they've beaten up on a lot of tankers during their 10-game win streak. But either way, the first round series is going to be relatively tough, I think, for all four of those teams at the top of the Eastern Conference. And then I honestly think the best position to be in if you're the Cleveland Cavaliers is the 4 seed. So you get Detroit in round 2, Boston and New York beat each other up in the second round, and then you get whoever comes out of that heavyweight fight in the Eastern Conference Finals, and you take your chances and see what happens. I still said it before, and I'll say it again. I have a hard time seeing the roadmap for any of these teams making it to the NBA Finals. So it should make for a very interesting Eastern Conference playoff race. All right, let's jump to topic number 2, the MVP race and whether or not it's over. Shai obviously hit the dagger a week ago against Denver on the 2 step back to the right 3-pointers that helped to push Oklahoma City over the Nuggets in that matchup, which was one of the games of the year. And Shai has only continued to do the same thing. He had 40 tonight in their win over Orlando, who I know they had lost one game prior to coming to Oklahoma City, but prior to that, they had won 7 in a row, including an impressive victory over the Cavs. So, look, Shai just continues to put up staggering statistics. Obviously, he broke Wilt's streak of 20-point games he's at, I think that streak currently stands at 128, I think tonight made it, of 20-plus points in a game. Oklahoma City has the best record in the NBA at 54-15. They're not going to get 70 wins, but they're going to be in the mid-60s. And when you look at Shai's statistical resume and what he's doing, it's hard to imagine that anybody's going to surpass him when Oklahoma City is the team at the top of the NBA with the best record. Shai right now, this season, is playing just under 34 minutes a game. He's shooting 54.9% from the floor, again, as a guard. He's shooting 38% on threes, which is up from his career average. He's also shooting more threes per game and shooting almost 90% from the line. He's currently at 89.4 with 4.5 rebounds, almost 7 assists, and he's averaging 31.6 points per game. What he's doing as a guard statistically probably hasn't been done since Michael Jordan. And I just think that what he's been able to accomplish, both from a narrative standpoint and the big shots and the breaking of Wilt's record, the fact that he's played, and I know he was out and missed a few games, and he still has some games to get to the 65-game threshold, but it looks like at this point, barring another injury, that he's probably going to get there. I just think that he continues to be the driving force behind Oklahoma City and their best record in the league. Obviously, a lot of the season they've done it without Jalen Williams. They've had a lot of other injuries with Hartenstein missing time. You've had Caruso missing time. And Oklahoma City continues to chug along. I know they went off to a 24-1 start, and since then they've come back to earth to some degree, but they're still far and away the best team in the NBA right now and the prohibitive favorites to win the title. So I think Shai has to be at the top. And then the next 2 guys, Jokic, who's always right there, coming back from his injury. He hasn't been quite as good shooting the ball or taking care of the ball. He's been more turnover prone since he returned from that injury. But that being said, statistically over the course of the season, his numbers are still ridiculous. He's averaging just under 35 minutes, 57% from the floor, 39% from 3, 83% from the line, averaging a triple-double, 12.7 rebounds and 10.5 assists. I know his turnovers are up, but he's averaging 3.8 turnovers. But when you're averaging 10.5 assists, still gives you a pretty good assist-to-turnover ratio. When you watch Jokic play, he still has the best touch of any guy around the basket. Defensively, he's been less than stellar this year. However, he still is a guy who has very good hands, is able to poke the ball away from people, is able to be a deterrent just with his position and his size. And then he's one of the best defensive rebounders in the game. And when he pulls off a defensive rebound and gets out into the open court with the ball, it is death for the opponent. And I think that's one of the scariest things a defense can see is Jokic grabbing the rebound and putting the ball on the floor and taking it out and leading the fast break usually leads to something good for Denver. I think what hurts Jokic is just, again, he hasn't been as good since he came back from the injury. He's going to probably just squeak into the 65 game limit, I believe. Let's see. He has 52 games played, and the Nuggets, I think, let's see. The Nuggets have played 68 games. So they have 14 games left, and Jokic could miss theoretically 2 of those games and still be eligible. So I think he's fallen behind Shai in the race for MVP, partly because the Nuggets are currently sitting in 6th, and partly because he just has not been quite as good shooting the ball as he was prior to the injury. His field goal percentage in the last 10 games is 52, which obviously is still very, very good. His three-point percentage, though, has dropped down to 27. I believe he was over 40 for most of the season. And he continues to put up big numbers in the rebound and assist categories, but he just hasn't quite been as good. And the Nuggets being a 6 seed probably is going to preclude him from winning the NBA's MVP this year. And then the other guy I think that you have to talk about, and maybe there's 2, I guess Wemby is the next guy probably at this point, I'd say going to finish 3rd. A guy who impacts both ends of the floor. And I think that when you start looking at it, is a huge feather in Wemby's cap moving forward. Obviously, he's going to be the defensive player of the year if he's eligible. He's right along with Jokic, has a game or 2 leeway in order to get to that 65 game limit. But what Wemby's doing right now, he's averaging just under 30 minutes a game. He's shooting 50% from the floor, 36% from 3. Again, this is from a guy who's 7'5", 81% from the line. He's averaging 11 rebounds, 3 assists, 3 blocks, and he just impacts the game in every way. And San Antonio is a team that right now is in 2nd place in the West, and I don't think anybody saw that coming. And again, San Antonio has played relatively well when Wembanyama's off the floor, but their ceiling when he's on the floor is ridiculous. I won't be surprised if Wemby finishes 2nd in the MVP voting, despite the fact that Jokic is basically averaging a 29-11 or 29, 12, and 11 triple-double, those are insane numbers. But what Wembanyama is doing on both ends of the floor, he's having an impact in ways that we've never seen a guy have the kind of impact that he does defensively, and then just the skill set that he has on offense, both from the outside, where I think teams would prefer to see him, and then on the inside, where obviously his length and height just gives him the ability to dominate around the basket when he so chooses to be in there. And so as his career develops, it'll be super interesting to see where his 3-point shot gets to. And like I said, right now he's shooting 36%. If he could get that up into the low 40s, I don't know what you're going to be able to do with Wembanyama moving forward. He's 22 years old, and already he has elevated the Spurs in a way that I don't think anybody saw the leap that this team has taken coming this year. So as the 2 seed in the West, and we're going to get to this in a second, it will be interesting to see how the bracket plays out and who ends up playing who. But we'll talk a little bit about how that might play out here in just a second. And then I think the last guy that you probably have to mention, just because of the recent surge from the Lakers, is Luca, who's leading the league in scoring, leading the league in whining to officials, and leading the league in, well, I don't know if he's leading the league, but certainly his effort ebbs and flows on the defensive end of the floor. Let's put it that way. But offensively, it is hard to argue what Luca is capable of doing. The game the other night, I believe Saturday night or Sunday night, maybe it was Saturday night, when he beat the Nuggets in overtime with the drive to the left, step back, fade away, and knocked it down to help the Lakers knock off the Nuggets in what was an outstanding game where Austin Reeves chucks a free throw off the rim, grabs it, and is able to put in a little runner to send the game to overtime when it looked like the Lakers were dead in the water. But Luka's been outstanding over the last few games. And in his last 10, he's averaging 33.5 points per game, up from his 32.9 for the regular season. And he just has every skill that you could possibly want for an offensive player. It feels like he can get just about any shot he wants. It feels like he can get to any type of pass that he wants to get to. And clearly at this point, I think Jason and I have been talking about all year that the Lakers feel not necessarily fraudulent, but that we weren't sure if they are a real title contender. And I'm not sure that they are, but I do know that if you have an engaged Luca on both ends of the floor, not that he's ever going to be a great defensive player, but if you can at least get some effort from him, like Dallas got in their run to the NBA Finals a couple of years ago with him, and then you obviously have LeBron, who isn't going to be playing defense on every possession for 48 minutes during a regular season game, but he could turn it on for moments during playoff basketball, you would think. Can the Lakers have a semi-functional defense? And I know over the last 20 games or so, their defense has been in the upper half of the league. And that might be all they need with as good as their offense has been. So we shall see what happens with the Lakers, but I think Luka has to be on the ballot probably for MVP. He certainly played his way into that position. So I think if I was voting, my ballot right now would probably go SGA. I'd probably still have Jokic number 2. I'd have Wemby number 3. Number 4, I would probably put Luka. And then 5, I think you'd probably give the nod to Cade Cunningham, simply because of what the Pistons have done in the East throughout this entire season. And then this discussion kind of leads us into what I was alluding to earlier with the Western Conference and how teams would probably like to set up the bracket if they could. Just like in the East, I think all things being equal, I'm guessing that Boston, New York, Cleveland would probably all like to face the Pistons in the second round if they could. Now, again, that doesn't take into account home court advantage and where the teams sit right now, but I think that's probably the easier path from the 4-5 game, and then the 1 versus 4 seeds, and then you get to the Eastern Conference Finals. I think in the West, I think it's probably the opposite. I think teams are going to be doing everything they can to avoid the 4-5 and trying to hope that they fall into the 3-6. And if you're in the 3-6, then that means in the second round, you're going to get the Spurs, who have, as currently constituted anyway, have very little to no playoff experience, certainly no playoff experience collectively as a team. You've got a couple guys, Harrison Barnes, De'Aaron Fox, who have played playoff basketball, but certainly not in the case of Fox, who's played 1 series for Sacramento against Golden State. Harrison Barnes has a little bit more experience early on with the Warriors in his career, but certainly the bulk of the Spurs roster, when you think about Wembanyama and Castle and Devin Vassell and that group, those guys certainly don't have any playoff experience. So I think if you're in the 6 seed, that gives you an opportunity, or the 3, that gives you an opportunity. I'm sorry, let me say that again. If you are in the 4-5, that's going to give you the Oklahoma City Thunder, which you want to avoid. If you are in the 3-6, that's going to give you San Antonio in the second round, which I think is where you want to be, because rather than facing Oklahoma City in round number 2, you get to postpone seeing Oklahoma City until the Western Conference Finals. And who knows? Again, I think when I look at these top 6 Western Conference teams, I don't think there's anybody in the play-in that's going to threaten any of the teams in the top 6. I guess the Clippers, if Kawhi's healthy, although he's right now out with an ankle injury, Garland is back. I still think that the Clippers could be an interesting team, maybe, to beat somebody in the top 6, but I don't know. It would take a lot. Let's put it that way. It would take a lot for them to be able to knock off one of those top 6 seeds. And I don't think the Phoenix Suns, the Golden State Warriors, as currently constructed, and the Portland Trailblazers. I don't think any of those teams are beating anybody in the top 6. So the question then becomes, when you look at these teams, who can legitimately win the Western Conference out of these 6 teams? I think the Thunder can. I think the Spurs can. I'm not convinced the Lakers can win 3 series. I don't think Houston can win 3 series. I think Minnesota, despite the fact that they have been very up and down, they are a complete roller coaster where when they look good, they look great. When they look bad, they can be terrible and have terrible decisions, bad offense, don't play well in the clutch. They need a good version of Julius Randle in order for them to get to where they want to go. And then Denver right now currently is sitting in the 6th spot. I still think the healthy version of the Nuggets, if they get Peyton Watson back, if Aaron Gordon can stay healthy, if Jokic continues to recover from his injury and get back into the playing mode that he was in prior to it. Obviously, Jamal Murray's had a career year. I still think Denver has all the pieces that you need, led by Nikola Jokic, who, whether you want to argue he's the best player in the world or the second best, if you think Shai is elevated above him, I still think Denver has what it takes to win an NBA title if they're healthy. So I'm kind of eliminating, I guess, the Lakers and Rockets. Maybe the Lakers have a puncher's chance just because of how well Luka's playing, but I still think defensively it's going to be a struggle, and I just don't think they're as good as Oklahoma City, San Antonio, Minnesota, or Denver when it comes to playoff basketball. But we'll see. When you have Luka and LeBron and then throw in Austin Reeves, obviously they have some offensive firepower that could make that an interesting series against a lot of these teams. So I think we're going to see the 4 teams behind Oklahoma City and San Antonio. I think we're going to see maybe not some shenanigans, but teams are going to try to finish in the 3 and 6 and avoid that 4 or 5 so they don't have to play Oklahoma City in round 2. And they'll get San Antonio, who that's not going to be a picnic. San Antonio is primed and ready to go, but again, inexperienced compared to Oklahoma City, who won the title last year. Maybe the Spurs are a year away. Maybe they're not. I think they can definitely get to the Western Conference Finals. And can they beat Oklahoma City? Certainly if Oklahoma City is diminished and Jalen Williams isn't healthy, I think it's possible. I'll still probably pick Oklahoma City to come out of the Western Conference, but certainly San Antonio and I think Denver are probably the 2 biggest threats to the Thunder in the West. All right, our next topic, the NCAA tournament, which starts, well, it actually started tonight with the first 4 games, or the first 2 of the first 4 games. And then the tournament kicks off with what used to be round 1, but I don't know if they're calling it round 2. But anyway, we have the NCAA tournament. And what I really wanted to talk about in relation to the NCAA tournament is the top 4 guys who we're going to see. Well, we won't see Caleb Wilson, but we're going to see the other 3 in the NCAA tournament. And obviously there's been a lot of controversy around Darren Peterson and his health and why he's playing or why he's not playing. Is he not as explosive as he looked back when he was a high school player? There still seems to be a consensus that from an offensive standpoint that this guy has a skill set that translates very easily and quickly to the NBA. I feel like after some of the things that have gone on this year at Kansas, it would certainly make me question not necessarily his talent, but where his mind is at. We've seen over and over again in the NBA that guys who have quirks and things that leave you questioning how hard they're going to play or how much they love the game, maybe it makes you think twice about Darren Peterson. So I'll be curious to see what he looks like in this tournament and whether or not the bright lights get him to come to play or not, and whether or not that ends up impacting where teams take him. I think number 2, probably Dybansta is the number 2 guy. He's been obviously the leading scorer in the country as a freshman. His team, BYU, with the loss of Richie Saunders, probably isn't that much of a threat. Maybe they can get to the Sweet 16. I would be very surprised if they can go much further than that. Dybansta has proven that he can score. I think the question for him at the next level is how much of a playmaker will he be? His athleticism, which honestly, I saw some highlights of him as a high school player where it looked like his athleticism just completely jumped off the screen. And don't get me wrong, he's still, I think, going to be a great athlete or is a great athlete, but maybe not to the level that I originally thought when I saw that old highlight reel of him. It feels like now he's more of a crafty type of scorer. And yeah, he has some bounce, but he's not necessarily going to be at the very, very top of elite athletes in the NBA, which it'll be interesting to see how that translates for him in terms of his scoring and his ability to play make at the next level. Then you have Boozer, who the concern with him is his athleticism and can he play against taller, rangier guys who he's going to see in the NBA? What's his position? He can shoot threes, but basically we're talking about catch and shoot, stand still, not getting off quick, not shooting off the move. And he's not a super high flyer, so he's got to kind of do his work almost like his dad, where it's more of a workman-like production. And yet at the same time, this guy just has put up crazy, crazy stats for a freshman. It feels like every game he's consistently putting up his numbers. And so I think the question with him, right, is can it translate to the NBA when he's going up against great athletes every single night? I guess when I look at him, I wonder what's his go-to play? What's the thing that he's going to be able to do consistently against anybody that he plays against? And I'm not quite sure what that is. That doesn't mean he's not going to be a great player, but I wonder if he can be a franchise guy that's going to carry your team. And I have questions about Peterson and Dybansta in that area too, because Peterson obviously with the motor and the whatever's going on in terms of his competitiveness. And then Dybansta, I do think that he's got probably, to me, I think he's the most sure thing of those three guys, because I think his scoring is going to translate, and I can see what he is if he's the best player on your team. The other two, I have a little bit harder time projecting. And then there's Caleb Wilson from Carolina, who anybody who listens to the podcast or sees my hat that I'm wearing knows I'm a Carolina fan. And when I went down and had the opportunity to see Caleb Wilson live against Central Arkansas and friend of the pod, John Schulman, and he had 4 dunks in his very first college game before the first TV timeout, I was like, oh, yeah, this guy just athletically is completely off the chart. So what he's going to be able to do, I think, defensively at the next level because of his explosiveness. The thing that stuck out for me too when I saw him in person, and I think it continued to show throughout the season, is just his ability to pass the ball. I think is underrated. I think he has really good vision. He's going to have to tighten up his handle. He's probably going to have to develop his 3-point range. Right now, he's more of a mid-range guy with his jump shot, but his athleticism is kind of what I thought maybe Dybansta was going to be like when I saw those early highlight films of him a year or two ago. But Caleb Wilson just elevates over everybody and even over elite athletes. And so I think that athleticism just gives you an advantage if you can figure out a way to harness it. So I won't be surprised, in all honesty, if it was me, I'd have a hard time passing on Wilson. I don't know if he's going to be, well, I know he's not going to be the number 1 pick, but I could honestly see him, depending on how things fall, I could see him going as high as number 2 and falling behind or jumping ahead of, for sure, Boozer. And then depending upon positional need, maybe he even jumps ahead of one of those other guys. I think one of those 3 is probably going to go number 1. But, man, seeing Caleb Wilson in person and watching what he does and just his athleticism, I think if he has any kind of a work ethic going into the NBA, that he has the potential to maybe be the best player in that entire class, which is saying something because most people think that there are those guys, the 3 at the top, have franchise player potential. And to be honest with you, I would lump Caleb Wilson in there as a top 4, make them all interchangeable. I don't think he's going to go number 1, but I think there's going to be some teams that 5 years down the road are going to wish that maybe they had taken Caleb Wilson instead of one of those top 3 guys, but we'll see. So that's what I'm watching for in the NCAA tournament. Obviously, we won't see Caleb Wilson, but I'm really interested to see Peterson, Dybansta, and Boozer on the big stage and see what they do individually and see what their teams can do. Topic number 5, and our last one, is expansion is now coming in the NBA, and it looks like it's going to be for the 28-29 season that the league is going to add franchises in Seattle and Las Vegas. The price tag that Shams threw out there today was between 7 and 10 billion, which makes sense. Celtics sold for 6.5 billion, and the Lakers went supposedly for 10. So that price tag seems about right. I do think that the league is trying to right a wrong when it comes to putting a team back in Seattle. And obviously, the Seattle franchise at the time moved to Oklahoma City and became the Thunder. However, my understanding is that when the Seattle Supersonics come back, which that by all accounts will be the name and the franchise, and so we'll revive the Sonics name, but all of the records for the Sonics franchise will come back to the new version. I always like the Sonics logo. I always like the Sonics uniforms. I like the Sonics colors. And I think to have a team back in Seattle will be great. And then you have the Las Vegas team, which obviously Vegas over the last few years has brought in the NFL. They've brought in Major League Baseball. They've brought in the NHL, and we are now going to bring in the NBA. And so I don't know what the name of the Las Vegas team was. I heard, I think on a podcast today, that somebody said the Blackjacks. Obviously, you have in the WNBA the Aces, which is a pretty solid name. You have to figure it's going to, in some way, pay homage to the gambling industry in Las Vegas. So Blackjacks is probably an interesting choice, but who knows what that franchise is going to be. And I think the question everybody's asking is now the right time for the NBA to expand? I think that the answer that the league has come to obviously is yes. When you look at the amount of money that it is required to purchase an NBA team, already we're getting down to where individuals having this amount of money, there aren't very many of them. And so you're starting to get groups that have to pool money together in order to form an ownership group to own these teams. And it also is going to be a big chunk of change for the current 30 NBA owners, where if they get, let's say, 15 million for the 2 franchises that they're going to add, that will be about a $500 million check to each NBA team. Now, it does cut down the percentage of future revenue that each team would get from 1/30th of the revenue from TV deals and marketing and everything else to 1/32nd, which I saw somewhere. I think it was 3.3% back to 3.1%, something like that, which doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you're talking about billions of dollars over the course of these TV contracts, it is. But that $500 million check that each owner or each franchise is going to cash when this deal goes through probably will, I think, persuade most of the owners to be okay with the idea of expansion. Then you start talking about what are some of the ramifications of expansion. You got to put together an expansion draft. I've heard Steve Kerr and others talk about the idea of shrinking the schedule and how that could potentially be good for the league. I don't think that's going to happen simply because of the amount of money that each team gets from hosting 41 home games a year. And even if you knock 10 games off the schedule and you lose 5 home games, that's a pretty significant piece of revenue that the owners lose, that the players lose. And so I'm not sure that anyone wants to do that, despite the fact that they probably do play too many games, especially the way that basketball is played today, which is why you see players taking games off and resting and all those kinds of things. And I don't know, it's interesting in terms of where these teams are with playing 82 games. You look back in the past and the number of players that played in 82 games or close to it was much, much higher than it is now, where oftentimes the best players are playing in the 70, 72 range. That's if they're healthy for the entire year, let alone if somebody misses some games. And it's a problem that the NBA has to figure out. I don't know what they're going to do, and I don't know how they do it. Probably if you shorten the schedule, you get guys playing a higher percentage of the games. I don't know if that's feasible or it's not. I would guess no, again, because of the financial ramifications. And then I think the other thing that you look at when you talk about this expansion piece is we already have all this tanking, and there's 8, 9, 10 teams right now that are actively not trying to win games. And Adam Silver's already hinted at the fact that he's going to make major changes, not for this year's draft, but certainly for the 2027 draft, that things may be coming down the pike. So it'll be interesting to see what he comes up with. But I think expansion overall, I'd be excited to see 2 franchises added. I'd be excited to have the Seattle Supersonics back in the league. And for the market of Seattle, which is and has been a basketball city in the past, I think it would be great to have the Sonics back, which it looks like that's what's going to happen. So then the last piece of expansion that would have to be figured out is in order to balance out the Eastern and Western Conference, because obviously both Vegas and Seattle would be added to the West, then it becomes which team is going to move east. And the 3 furthest east of the Western teams are the Timberwolves, the Pelicans, and the Grizzlies. I believe actually that Memphis is the furthest east, but Minnesota is the most geographically isolated of those 3 teams. In other words, they have much further flights to get to all the Western Conference teams, whereas Memphis and New Orleans are relatively close to each other. They're relatively close to the Texas teams. And so their travel isn't nearly as daunting as the travel for Minnesota. So it'll be interesting. I'm sure that all 3 of those teams will lobby to get themselves moved to the Eastern Conference, which has historically been the weaker of the 2 conferences. Maybe not this year. You could make an argument, at least in the middle. Certainly, I think probably Oklahoma City at the top and maybe even San Antonio and Denver would be favored over any Eastern Conference team that makes it to the finals. But traditionally, the Eastern Conference has been the weaker of the 2. And so I think that Minnesota, Memphis, and New Orleans will all put in their pitch to try to be the team that moves east. But if I was betting, I would guess probably the team that's going to end up moving is the one that's, like I said, most geographically isolated, which is the Minnesota Timberwolves. So that's my thoughts on expansion as of right now. Those are my thoughts on 5 topics in the NBA: the Cavs and Eastern Conference seeding, the MVP race, which I believe Shai is leading, the Western Conference seeding, where teams want to get to that 3 spot or the 6 spot to avoid the 4-5 and Oklahoma City in the second round. And then we have watching the top 3 draft picks potentially in the NBA draft, watching them play in this month's March Madness NCAA tournament. And finally, expansion to Seattle and Vegas, which overall I think is a good thing. And like I said, I'm excited to see the Seattle Supersonics of my youth come back to the NBA. So thanks for checking out tonight's NBA episode here on the Hoopheads Pod, and we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks.